But thank you all so much for joining us. Author James Grippando will discuss his new legal thriller, Grave Danger, in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So, James is a New York Times bestselling author with more than 30 books to his credit, including 19 in his acclaimed series featuring Miami criminal defense attorney Jack Swyteck. He's the winner of the Harper Lee Prize for legal fiction. He is also a trial lawyer and teaches law and literature at the University of Miami School of Law. And lucky for him, he lives in South Florida, as Massachusetts just experienced its first snowstorm of the winter yesterday. So, folks, let's give James a big virtual round of applause for tonight's program. And he has a presentation for us on his brand new legal thriller, Grave Danger, and then we'll take questions. So, James, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Robert. And thank you all for joining from wherever you are. This book is not set in Massachusetts, but I did want to start out by saying that I actually have written a couple of books that are set in Boston and that area. A book called Intent to Kill is about a minor league Pawtucket Red Sox player. And a book called Lying with Strangers that I wrote in 2006 is set in Children's Hospital in Boston. And you may be wondering, what's the Boston connection? And there isn't a strong one, other than that my family vacationed in Martha's Vineyard for years, and so I've known the area and felt an affinity for the area. And my daughter just graduated high school from Walnut Hill School for the Arts, just outside of Boston. So I know what your winters are like. I have visited her many times up there. But this is Grave Danger we're talking about tonight. It is set in South Florida. As I was talking to Robert beforehand, I realized, well, there is actually a Boston connection for this book. And so where I got people always ask, where did the idea come from, right? And so this was when my daughter was a student in 2022 at Walnut Hill. We stayed right there on the Boston Common. Copley Square, this is. And near the Boston Public Library. And it was December. We took our dog up for Christmas and stayed in I think it was the Fairmont Hotel there. And he loved it because he lives in Florida, but he loved going on the ice on the skating rink with the skaters in Boston Common. But there in Copley Square, I took him out one morning for a walk, and it was literally 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And I saw these women standing on the steps of the Boston Public Library with their protests, Women, Life, Freedom. And Women, Life, Freedom became, around September of 2022, you remember, it became sort of an international slogan, but it started in Iran. And it started in September. Hopefully I'm trying to move these slides along, and I'm hoping they're moving, but
it's working, James. It's working.
It is working. Okay, great. In September 2022, this beautiful young woman named Gina Masa Amini, quote unquote, died unexpectedly in the custody of Iran's morality police. And she was taken into custody for improper clothing, which was violation of the modesty laws. And she wasn't walking around in anything provocative or improper. She simply was not covering her hair, which was the law. And just to give you an idea, I mean, this is not like I don't want to give the impression that women are forced, to wear the burqas and completely cover themselves. You can take whatever interpretation of that not whatever you want, but there's a range of compliance with the law. And you see, I have a picture here of on the top of women, a bit more fashionable, maybe, right, but still in compliance with the law. But the law required the headscarf and the loose-fitting cloak, and it is enforced. And lately, since 2022, it's enforced vigorously and even violently by the morality police, which is a law enforcement group. They have access to power. They're armed. They have detention centers, and they run what are called re-education centers. So, and I think once I got into the research for this and decided, oh, this is, when I saw those women out in 4 degrees temperatures protesting, I just felt compelled to dive into it more and write something about it. So I started doing the research and realized, that this morality code about the headscarf is really much, much more than just a dress code. Right. And there it is, the clerical leadership, Khomeini, the supreme leader since '89. He is the most powerful political authority in Iran, head of state, commander in chief of the armed forces, issues decrees on final public policy. But I thought also, that the reality of the situation is described in this piece from the New Yorker that I quote here, is that women have fewer rights than men in marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance. I won't get into the details of that, but I mean, you probably have a working familiarity with this if you followed the news at all. But I did not know this, for example, that a woman's legal testimony is granted half the weight of a man, making them more vulnerable to rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other forms of gender-based violence. Because, we've all heard that expression in various circumstances where, it's a battle of he said, she said. Well, that battle of he said, she said, when the woman's testimony is by law given half the weight of the man's, you can pretty much see where that is, how that is going to play out. So with the death of Mahsa Amini, these massive protests emerged, which were remarkable, not just in their size, but in their courage, for the way people took to the streets to protest, angered by the death, shocked by the death, but also just fed up with the circumstances that they've been living under. Unfortunately, the uprising itself came at great costs, and women and young girls were at the brutal end of that cost. Another young girl, age 16, this was a terrible case. She was dragged from a protest, and her body was delivered to the family 10 days later, and they were told that she had jumped off a building. And it gets worse than that. I mean, the aunt and uncle of the young girl were forced to go on state television and talk about what, supporting the government's view that it was a suicide and how tragic it was. And I don't speak Farsi, but reportedly there are those who have seen the video, and you can hear someone in the sidelines of that recording telling the family what they have to say. And this one really struck home to me because my daughter, she went to a boarding school in Boston, and I'm thinking of my daughter in high school boarding school away from home. Well, this girl, Arsa Panahi, 15, simply refused to sing a pro-regime song after the police raided the girl's high school, and they beat her to death. It's a horribly brutal enforcement mechanism that the government turns loose not just on the general population, but even teenage girls. I kind of got fascinated, took it back up. Well, when I saw women, not this really spread, right? I mean, there were places in the United States where protests were held and women were cutting their hair, and I'm like, okay, they're cutting their hair, and there was in protest of a law that requires the hijab, or some sort of cloak over the hair. But I did some research on this too and discovered in Persian culture, it's one of the most recurring metaphors in poetry. As I say here, it's like almost spiritual. The essence of a person's soul, is one poet wrote. So it is a powerfully symbolic movement, a form of protest for women to be taking to the streets and cutting their hair. It's not an act of self-mutilation. This is a powerful symbolic message of protest. And the government really was at a loss. What are we going to do? Men, women are taking to the street. Women are cutting their hair in protest. Well, it was a brutal response to it. And so over the next few months, almost 551 people killed. This is Amnesty International data, so I haven't verified it, but I borrowed it from them. Almost 20,000 arrests in the city. Capital punishment, so trying to deter people from taking to the streets. Executions increased by 75%. And then this was the interesting point, and I'm going to emphasize this for you because it became, I'm doing a lot of research at this point for the book. What's the story going to be about? And there were internet blackouts, restrictions on social media, news blackouts. So it was very difficult for the world to find out what was going on with the government crackdown on the free flow of information. And so what I discovered had developed was this sort of daisy chain of women, Iranian women, who kept information flowing after the internet was shut down. Of course, it would be very difficult if you were caught by the morality police passing along messages. So the rule that they had was, receive a text, read it, pass it on, and hit delete. So that if somebody takes your phone, they couldn't find out that you were passing along information about, oh, they're firing rubber bullets in this square, or they're attacking protesters in this town, or what have you, or this school was raided. You just type that in and pass it along to someone, and through this daisy chain of information, the information would eventually find its way out of the country. And that's how a lot of the news coverage was supplied the information that they needed to make the world aware of what was going on. Okay, so that's sort of the research point. So now I am a writer, and I'm not a nonfiction writer, right? I write stories for entertainment. I write thrillers and suspense. And, my series, this Grave Danger, is the 19th book in the Jack Swyteck series. He's a Miami criminal defense lawyer. He's not Jason Bourne. He's not James Bond. And he's definitely not Rambo, right? So I had this idea for this character, and I named her Ava, as part of the information network fighting these terrible odds, right? Trying to get information out to the world. But that leaves the question of, how the heck does Jack Swyteck fit into this? So let's just sort of pause on that for a moment. And who's Jack? So I created him when I was a much younger man, and that's me. And upon the release of the pardon in 1994, and Jack was this rebellious young criminal defense lawyer who defended only death row inmates. His father, by the way, was the law and order governor of Florida who signed the death um, certificates, not certificates, but the death warrants for the execution of some of Jack's clients. And so there was this great father-son tension in that story. But again, it was based in the law. It was a courtroom thriller, right? So Jack has aged about one book per year, even though it started in the 90s. He's now only about 20 years older. He's an established criminal defense lawyer. Interesting fact, now later in the series, he met the love of his life, but she happens to be an FBI agent. Her name's Andie Henning, which you can imagine. So that creates a flashpoint in the stories, right? You had the tension between Jack and his father in the early part of the series. Now you have the tension between Jack and his FBI agent wife. He's not quite the ideologue that he used to be, but he still believes that justice can be obtained in the system if he works hard enough for all his clients, guilty or not. And occasionally he'll have one who's innocent, which makes it, it's the sweet spot, right? Obviously, people always ask me, so I might be preempting some questions from the audience here. Is Jack you? No, not really. I mean, I had this great relationship with my dad. I didn't have the struggles that Jack had with his father. I put this up that this used to be the first line of my website. My dad was a stripper, but that actually is a term from the printing industry. They would create they would. This is like all done by computer now. So my dad would be out of a job if he were a stripper in the printing business now. But Jack's mother died early in his childhood, so he was raised by his stepmother. Again, not me, that's my mom. I love that picture because that's when I won the Harper Lee Prize, and so my mother's now 97 and going strong. So she'll be at my next event she still reads my books too. So which is even funner. So um I had to think of some legal angle, right, for this story of if I was going to write a story about this character Ava who smuggled information out. And so I created Ava as a young mother in Iran, and she has a 5-year-old daughter, and Ava disappears, and her 5-year-old daughter turns up in Miami, and but the father is still in Iran. And you can kind of see where this is probably going, right? All right, the father's still in Iran. The mother is in Miami with the daughter. And there are rules governing, unless the father consents, which in this case he is not, there are rules governing parental abductions of children. And the law, it's governed by the Hague Convention, which is just a fancy name for a treaty that over 90 countries have agreed to. And so under that treaty, a U.S. court has to, if the non-abducting parent, in this case the father, objects to the mother taking the child to another country, it doesn't matter if it's what the reason is. The U.S. court has to return that child to the home country, in this case, Iran, unless the abducting parent, the mother, can show that that returning that child would subject him or her to grave risk of physical or emotional injury. So those words I put in red there stuck with me: grave risk of physical or emotional injury. And I thought, well, I took a little titular artistic license there. Is grave risk a good title? And I thought, meh, probably not. So I came up with grave danger. And so, Ava flees. The ex-husband sues in the U.S. court for the child's return. Jack is her lawyer. He decides he will represent the mother in this. Essentially, it's not his usual turf, but the case appeals to him. He takes it. And he somehow has to prove that returning that child to Iran would expose the child to grave danger of emotional or physical harm. And the stakes are as high as any criminal case Jack has ever handled, even though this has nothing to do with criminal law. If he loses, that mother loses her child to who in this case it's her ex-husband. She's divorced. The child will stay in Tehran and will never see that child again. Obviously, the mother would never be able to return to Iran, even if she wanted to. So I got into what does a lawyer do when they're representing a mother in one of these cases? And so this is sort of a typical, the cases are not, some of them are tragic. All of them are sad. Some of them are really tragic. The abductor is more often the mother than the father. Tragically, it's often a mother fleeing an abusive relationship. And where the case oftentimes goes is that even if the child was not abused, you can win these cases for the mother if you can show that the child witnessed abuse of the mother, because that witnessing of abuse, spousal abuse, is considered grave risk of emotional injury to the child, and the child can stay with the mother in whatever country they've landed in this case, Miami, Florida. This surprised me, and I worked this into the plot because, and again, this is not a typical Jack Swyteck novel in that sense, right? Because the State Department has to weigh in on these, gets involved, especially when you're dealing with a case which has, it's a bit of a political hot potato, right? You've got it's Iranian it's Iranian court system versus the U.S. court system. And I was surprised to find out that if I had Jack go to the State Department, which he does, he's not going to get a lot of help, because in fact, the father would get more help in this case than Jack, because the State Department would actually help the father, the Iranian father, trying to bring back his child, would help them find a lawyer to represent them in a U.S. court, and most definitely will not give the mother, in this case, the abducting parent, any form of aid whatsoever. And of course, you're probably wondering why not. I was too. And the reason is because every hour a U.S. citizen is abducted somewhere in the world. And the State Department's fear is that if they in any way are seen as showing support for the abduction of children and cannot, and for some reason stand in the way of the return of that child to his or her home country, what leg will the U.S. have to stand on when they demand the return of a child or another family member from that country to the United States? So as you can see, it's really a complicated situation. So what happens in the absence of help from the State Department, and I took the training course on this, it's part of, interest, part of it was research. Maybe I'll even take one of these cases, but there are hundreds of volunteer lawyers across the country who take these cases for usually mothers who are in an abusive relationship, flee the country, take their child to the United States, and now are facing a lawsuit and a treaty that disfavors their position of staying in the U.S. with their child and may force them to return that child to the home country. And one of the speakers at this training session for the continuing legal education or the Practicing Law Institute that I attended, the speaker was this fascinating judge. He's now a senior judge. His name, Judge Denny Chin. Smart guy, really smart guy. Was in the Southern District of Florida, Southern District of New York, federal judge. Now is a senior judge on the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And he had a degree in psychology from Princeton, so he knew his way around these difficult issues that even though most federal judges have no experience in federal court, I mean, with his degree in psychology, he sort of understood these cases better than most federal judges, and they're in federal court because it's under a treaty, right? So the father is suing under a treaty to get the child returned. And he shared this diagram that he asked. He took his approach was it requires a flexible approach. You're dealing with children and you can't necessarily have a typical courtroom scenario. So he actually took the child in that case back to his chambers and asked the child to draw a picture of her family. And she was I don't know, 5 years old maybe. And he shared this picture because it helped him make his decision. There was no father in the picture. She had deliberately omitted that from the artwork. Wasn't dispositive of the case, but he took that as very important piece of evidence that helped him make the decision about where that child belonged. This was a tough book to write, because it's still changing, and you worry when you write something about a book like this about an issue that's so timely that things could change so quickly. Although there were some constants, right? I mean, if you're old enough to remember, as I am, the takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, we've had no diplomatic relations with Tehran since 1979. And that dispute, these are iconic images, by the way. I'd never forget that image of, they took 53 diplomats hostage, held them for 444 days. As soon as Jimmy Carter was no longer president, they released them. Since 1984, Reagan named the state-sponsored Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism. But then even while I'm writing the book, you've probably forgotten this, but I'm wondering what's going on. There was this release of 5 American hostages, and the world was changing as I was writing the book, is basically my point here. So I was a little nervous going into this. So this is, what I came up with, is that there's almost the usual scenario that I described, but with a twist here is that Jack learns that his client, who he thought was the mother of this child, is actually the child's aunt. The mother has gone missing, and she may have been killed by Iran's morality police, may have been killed by somebody else, may have even been the father. It does become a bit of a murder mystery, even though this, as I say, is not the typical story, but typical Jack Swyteck story, but it does become a bit of a murder mystery in that, Jack has to uncover what role did Yasmin, is the young girl's name, Yasmin's father, playing the wife. And then it gets even more complicated, and I alluded to this earlier, is because suddenly Jack's wife, who is an FBI agent, is trying to talk him out of keeping this case. She wants him to dump it. And why? Why is his own wife joining the side of everybody in Washington who wants him to drop this case? So, in closing, and then I want to take some questions. I've been talking for quite a while here. Hopefully somebody's still there. But I get this. You'll see a lot of reviews of my books. They're ripped from the headlines, and I don't really think of them as ripped from the headlines. I really kind of think of them more as ripped from tomorrow's headlines, because I look at these forces that are in play, things that are inevitably going to clash, but they haven't clashed quite yet. And that's really where I take my stories. So, as a thriller writer, you're always asking, you always start with the question, what if? So it's not really a case of ripping something from the headlines and then writing that story. It's really about looking for those forces at work where there's going to be an exciting conflict, and then asking that question, what if, and writing it out in a novel length story that readers will enjoy. And hopefully you'll enjoy Grave Danger. So,
yeah. So, folks, let's give James a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. And James, let's take some questions from the audience. As I mentioned, I did solicit some questions in advance. And also, folks, if you want to ask a question now, feel free to type it into the chat box or into the Q&A box. James, and I did want to just say something up front. I had not read any of the previous 18 Jack Swyteck books, and I jumped right into it. And so that was not a deterrent for me. I really enjoyed the book, and now I want to go back and read the other books and learn about the start of his career. And I want to know more about his father, because his father kind of just makes a cameo appearance in this one. And I want to learn more about the relationship between his wife and his 8-year-old daughter. And so I'm totally invested into this series now, James.
that's really and that's a lot of fun when you discover a new author who actually has, a tremendous backlist and a series with 19 installments in them. And it's an important point you make, Robert, is that I write every book assuming my readers have never read a Jack Swyteck novel. So you're not going to get into Grave Danger and think, oh, I don't get this point. This must have been explained, 5 novels ago. That's not going to happen. Everything is it really does stand on its own.
Yeah. So one of the questions asked by the audience, how do you balance writing a successful series while also exploring new ideas in standalone novels? So, James, are you writing any standalone novels at the moment, or are you mainly focused on the series?
So I did release a standalone in 2022
Okay.
called Code 6, which was about sort of was it sort of a tech thriller, right? And it was an interesting story because I'd written a play about the loss of personal identity, personal information, and the world's first personal information crisis, which actually was the Holocaust. People don't realize that, but the way the Nazis determined everybody was Jewish was, yes, there was the Anne Frank situation where it was neighbor informing on neighbor and telling the Nazis that somebody was hiding in the attic, but how the Nazis identified most people as Jewish was through census data, processed through IBM technology. And one of the 1938 census, one of the questions was, did you have a Jewish grandmother? And people unwittingly just, either checked the box or didn't. Well, all of that data ended up in, the precursors to computers, and people who didn't even know they were Jewish ended up in concentration camps because somebody in the family identified that they had a Jewish grandmother. I wrote a play about that, um, and was really struck by the parallels by what's going on today and the dangers of how we so willingly give up our personal information and what's going to happen with it. So Code 6 became that, and I actually wrote a story about a young woman who wrote my play,
Yeah.
right? And then it finds herself in a modern day situation of another misuse of personal information that sort of the message is history repeats itself, right? And so but the question was, how do the question is a good one because writing a book in the series saves me about 4 months of work,
Mhm.
um, because I know the cast entirely. I don't just know the lead character, but there's Jack's father, there's Jack's best friend Theo, there's his wife Andie. So that saves me a tremendous amount of work. So I'm not able to um, write as many standalones as I would like to, but maybe that'll change when I finally stop practicing law and teaching. So there's only so many jobs you can have.
You're a busy guy, James, and there's so many hours
Yeah,
in the day.
yeah.
So getting back to Grave Danger, Judy wants to know, she knows it's a legal thriller. She wants to know how much of the book is set in the courtroom.
Oh gosh. Well, see, now that's a hard question to answer for this reason. I just finished the next Jack Swyteck novel a week ago.
Oh,
Um, so, um, so this is almost an old book for me, but uh, I would not call it a courtroom drama. There are courtroom scenes in
yeah,
it, but I would call this more of a suspense,
yeah,
and thriller than I would call it a courtroom drama. It's not in the it's not in the league of like presumed innocent or something like that, which is mostly courtroom scenes. And the courtroom scenes I do keep um, uh, moving.
yeah.
I understand that people, don't need to don't need too much information when it comes to that. That's the balance, right? Is trying to keep the book entertaining but accurate and informative.
Yeah, James, I'm blanking on her name, but the antagonist, the attorney for the father, I thought she did a good job of being a good foil to Jack. And as the book went on and we learned more and more about her motives, we liked her less and less. But
Yeah, yeah,
I liked the courtroom scenes for sure.
yeah. I enjoy writing them, but I also try to have a balance. And I think with Andy being the FBI agent,
Yeah.
that provides a really nice balance to the action in the story.
Yeah, and we were getting flashbacks back to Tehran and lots of things going on in this book for sure. So Marianne asks, have you ever visited countries like Iran or countries surrounding Iran? And she says, thank you so much for this presentation, and I look forward to reading this first book.
Yeah, and I have definitely not traveled to Iran. I don't speak Farsi. And so, if you read the acknowledgments, however, I did give um, a friend a shout out because she really uh, introduced me and shared with me insights into. She travels back to Tehran about every 6 months. She lives here in the United States now, but a lot of the authenticity, I think, to the scenes with Ava in the marketplace and taking her daughter to school, what that life is like really came a lot through Seema is her name, who I give the shout out to in the acknowledgments, who's really sort of invaluable because it's like that I was not going to travel to Iran. I made that decision very, very early on. I don't even know what it involves if you're not to get in there. So I certainly don't want to find out what it takes to get out once
Yeah,
you're there.
that's right.
So yeah.
Yeah. So, by the way, we're spoiler free, James. We don't want to spoil anything, as I'm sure you don't want to spoil anything. So this question is based on your presentation. So Suzanne asks, do you look at both sides while writing? So in this case, what if the father wasn't an abuser? Would the character Jack be prepared for this angle?
Yeah, there wouldn't be a story if there were not an allegations of right. Is that because again, the legal standard here for return is that the child must be at grave risk of suffering emotional or physical injury if the child is returned. So to answer the question is that if I had decided to make the character a great guy, there wouldn't have been a story to write about. There would be no legal angle to this story. Now, there would be all kinds of other issues, but there would be no place whatsoever for Jack Swyteck, a lawyer in Miami, to have a role in this case. So by creating the facts as I did, or at least as they appear to be, then there was and people, again, that's probably all I should say about that because
Right.
I don't want to have any spoilers in here.
Yep. So Jack asks, not Jack Swyteck, but another Jack asks, is Grave Danger available in audiobook format?
Yes, it is. All of my books are in audio, and um, Jonathan Davis, who does all of the Jack Swyteck books, has a huge following. I mean, I'm thankful to him because number one, he does a great job with the not only being Jack, but the entire cast in the Jack Swyteck series. And then secondly, I'm grateful to him because he's just such a great narrator that people will pick up my books just because he's narrating them. So yes, and I don't know if they're in the Massachusetts Public Libraries system in audio format, but they are in audio.
Yeah, they are available on Libby, and I actually listened to it on Audible. So I paid for it, but it was well worth the $15 or so. And you're so right, the narrator was excellent. So Sally, my friend Sally from Maynard asks, can you talk about the craft of pacing a thriller? Is there such a thing as too fast paced?
Um, to answer the last part of that question, yes, there is such a thing as too fast paced, and that's something that my editor has really helped me with because I usually end up getting inside the characters' heads a bit more after her read of my manuscript. She helps me slow down a little bit and say, I'm really wondering, I want to know the tone of voice here, or I want to know what's her reaction to what Jack is saying and sort of those things. So yeah, so I mean, you do want to have pacing is critical in a thriller. That's the genre, right? Is that you want people to be turning the pages and I mean, I can remember being told early 30 years ago, my agent Artie Pine represented James Patterson before Artie passed away. And he said, you got to look how he ends all his chapters. They always have a cliffhanger. They always have a cliffhanger. Now, that's a bit of an overstatement, but that is important, to the pacing of a thriller is to have maybe those mini cliffhangers after each chapter. Um, but yeah, the last part of that question is definitely in the affirmative. There, it can be too fast pacing because it's I mean what I've learned is that people will forget the plots of my novels, but they will remember the characters, right? So yeah, definitely you can get too caught up in what happens next and forget about caring about who it's happening to.
I think just with everything going on in the world right now, with the migrant crisis and the Middle East and whatnot. I will remember this plot for a little while, and I loved James the twists and the turns and the good guys doing bad things and the bad guys doing good things and the questioning everyone's motives and why people are doing what they're doing. Really, really just fascinating read. I loved all the twists. Nancy wants to know, James, do you ever sleep?
Yeah, but I do wake up every now and then while I'm sleeping with an idea. And Nancy, I can tell you that I've learned now after 30 years of writing that usually, I mean, like 9 times out of 10, um, those ideas I get that wake me up in the middle of the night are really not very good. So it takes a lot for me to give up my sleep and jump out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, "Oh, I've got to write this right now." I can't remember the last time I did that. I've learned to compartmentalize a little bit. And sometimes I'll jot something down or pick up my phone and type myself an email or something with some idea if I'm at a very critical stage of the book. But for the most part, I've learned that my most creative writing really happens between about 7 a.m. and noon. And so that helps, is to um but yeah, it's a there was a time when I did 2 books a year. I did it for 2 years in 2015 and 2016. And that really was no, I didn't sleep was the answer to that. That was just too much. At some point you were out, either you were writing a book or promoting a book or researching a book, and it was way too much and it took all the fun out of the process. And I can still remember, the first rule I made for myself, in the early 90s when I decided to be a writer was to keep it fun. And I didn't want the experience to in any way sour me out my love of books and especially my love of reading. Right. So yeah, I've learned to compartmentalize a bit.
James, do you have an ending in mind for the series, or that's still 20, 30 years away and you're not even thinking about that at this point?
An ending for the series? No, I don't, because like I said, I think, Jack is aging about a year a book, regardless of real time, right?
Yeah.
So right now he's only in his, fortunately, I didn't write The Pardon intending it to be a series. But fortunately, and then about 5 years after I wrote that book, there was, I started getting a lot of emails from people like, whatever happened to Jack? He was a young guy. He was 27 years old. And my editor said, yeah, let's bring him back. And so it's sort of serendipity, but it's lucky, he was only 27, in his first novel, 2 years out of law school. And so now he's, 47, 48 years old. So, he'll outlive me
There you
at
go.
this point. So.
James, two more quick questions. So, do you have any advice that you'd give to aspiring writers who maybe want to write their own thrillers?
Yeah, that's a hard one for me now, because, and it depends on why you want to write. So I would say the first, advice I would give is understand why you want to write. Um, and if you want to be a successful published author, if that's why you write, my advice is less relevant for that because I don't really know I don't know what to tell young writers now about how to break into writing. It used to be the old way would be you'd write the best book you possibly could. There would be an editor who would read the book thoughtfully. You'd have an agent who would be pushing for you. And I don't mean this cynically, but now it's so much driven by, do you have enough social media followers? Right? So I feel like my advice is a little stale on the, how to become a successful writer, but a successfully published writer. But for the advice I give to anyone is that you've got to find your own voice as a writer. So in the craft of writing, I feel like my advice is still relevant. And the one thing that um, uh, is sort of my litmus test question, especially with young people. I do a lot of talks for at schools and so forth, and I'll ask the kids, high school kids, or so what are you reading? And they'll be like, oh God, I have so much going on, so much work, and I read so much for class that I just don't have time to read. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe you want to rethink this thing about being a writer, right? Because if you're really not reading for pleasure, you're never going to find your own voice, right? That's part of the process of discovering, how writers write and how they craft and so yeah, you've got to be a reader to be a writer. I think that advice is still true.
And final question, James, is what's next for you? I know you're promoting book number 19. I think you just finished book number 20. I think you said earlier. Can you give us a little taste of book number 20, or will your publisher get mad at you?
Yeah, that it's not that the publisher would get mad at me. It's just that, and it is a Jack Swyteck novel, and the cast is back. Yeah, so in full. And I can tell that much about it. But it is, I mean, literally, I'm I'm still writing the epilogue
Oh,
for
wow.
that. So
Okay.
it's a little, yeah, I have
Yeah.
to deliver it in 2 weeks, but and I can tell you it'll probably be out in January of 2026. So put your name on the list.
There you go. Excellent. So, James, was there anything I should have asked you that I didn't? Any last words for the audience? Anything you want to leave us with?
Just stay warm, and I hope you enjoy Grave Danger. Thanks for joining me. I love doing these events, and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah. Uh, Wonderful. Well, maybe we'll do it again next January for book 20.
That's
So,
it.
folks, let's give James a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. Look for an email from me later tonight with a link to the recording, information from Wellesley Books, and information about upcoming virtual author visits. Please take the 60-second feedback survey that pops up when you exit the Zoom. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, James.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye bye.